Lecture 78, Franz Kafka.
Block here? He asked. This query delivered a virtual blow to Block, striking him in the chest and then in the back so that he stumbled, came to a stop with a deep bow, and said, "At your service." "What do you want?" asked the lawyer. "You've come at an inopportune time." "Wasn't I summoned?" asked Block, lifting his hands protectively and ready to retreat. "You were summoned," said the lawyer, "but you've still come at an inopportune time." And after a pause, he continued, "You always come at inopportune times." "Do you wish me to leave?" asked Block. "You're here now," said the lawyer. "Stay." One would have thought the lawyer had threatened to flog Block, not grant his wish, for now Block began to tremble in earnest. "Yesterday," said the lawyer, "I visited the third judge, my friend, and gradually brought the conversation around to you. Do you want to know what he said?" "Oh, please," said Block. Since the lawyer didn't reply at once, Block repeated his entreaty and stooped as if to kneel. But then Kay lashed out at him. "What are you doing?" he cried. The man who lashes out at Block is Joseph Kay, the doomed protagonist of Franz Kafka's novel The Trial, first published in Berlin in 1925. Arrested one morning for reasons that are never explained to him, but allowed his freedom while his case is pending, Joseph Kay has hired a lawyer named Huld, recommended by his uncle Albert, who has known the lawyer ever since they were schoolboys together. But Huld has no office. Though highly regarded as a defense counsel, he suffers from a heart condition and keeps to his bed in a dark, gloomy room of his ground-floor apartment in a suburb of the unnamed capital city where the novel is set. In bed, he's attended by a nurse named Lenny, who turns out also to be his mistress. By the time this scene takes place, the trial of Joseph Kay is 6 months old. But the English word trial just roughly approximates the German word Prozess, which can mean many things besides a formal event in a court of law. In this book, it means, among other things, a seemingly endless process of deepening bewilderment, a long ordeal of pseudo-legal complication and frustration, leading finally to death. By the time Joseph Kay goes to see his lawyer, in the chapter that I've just quoted from, he's been waiting 6 months for his lawyer to do something. Realizing that the lawyer has done nothing for him, that after all this time Huld is still working on the first petition to the court, Joseph Kay decides to dismiss him. When he reveals this decision to the lawyer, Huld temporizes. He warns Joseph Kay not to be too hasty, complains that his labors on this special case have been misunderstood, and offers to show Joseph how he treats other defendants, such as a merchant named Block. Before the lawyer summons Block for this purpose, Joseph Kay has already learned certain things about him from the man himself. Block is a grain dealer who has been on trial, we would say awaiting trial, for well over 5 years. Having drained his business and spent all of his money on his trial, and having fired 5 shysters in addition to the lawyer, having hired, 5 shysters in addition to the lawyer, he still has no firm date for formal proceedings. But he's so obsessed with his case that he has now practically taken up residence in Huld's apartment, where he sleeps in the maid's room, a tiny, low, windowless shoebox, just to be ready for the lawyer's call at any hour of the day or night. So when the lawyer tells Lenny to get him, he comes immediately, even though it's after 10 o'clock at night. From the moment he arrives, the lawyer twists him like a pretzel. Huld does everything possible to intimidate Block and exploit his almost pathological dependence on the lawyer's goodwill. Instead of thanking Block for coming so promptly, the lawyer tells him that he's come at a bad time, as always. When Block offers to leave, the lawyer curtly tells him to stay, and then tantalizes him with the news that the day before he discussed Block's case with a judge. When the lawyer asks Block if he wants to know what the judge said, Block, of course, begs him repeatedly to tell and nearly goes down on his knees. At this point, Joseph Kay lashes out at Block for his canine servility. Joseph can't imagine how the lawyer would think that this little performance would impress him, Joseph, with the lawyer's concern for his clients. Block, he thought, was no longer a client. He was the lawyer's dog. To clinch this point, the lawyer's account of what the judge said about Block's case hits the fawning merchant like a brick on the head. After desperately waiting to hear what the judge said, Block learns only that his remarks were not at all favorable for Block or his trial. According to the judge, the bell that opens the trial still hasn't rung. Before Block can even ask for an explanation, the lawyer tells him he's disgusted with Block's anxiety, for it betrays a lack of faith in the lawyer's wisdom. The judge, he says, could be wrong about what the ringing of the bell signifies. That teasing possibility is the only bone that Holt finally throws to Block, who has no other choice but to chew on it while literally groveling on the floor of the lawyer's bedroom. This story of the total humiliation of a merchant whose life has become one endless trial is just one episode in the story of Joseph K., who wakes up one morning to find himself suddenly under arrest and who then spends one full year in a futile effort to find out why. When Kafka started writing this novel in August of 1914, he was 31 years old, well established in business, known for a few published articles, and already the author of several short stories, including The Metamorphosis, which would shortly be published. Born in Prague, he was the eldest son of an upwardly mobile Jewish couple. His ambitious father, a one-time village peddler who managed to marry above him, owned a fancy goods shop in the Jewish quarter of the city, and as the business prospered, they moved to better locations, such as Wenceslaus Square in the heart of the city. Though the Kafkas spoke Czech at home, they wanted their children to be educated in German, and young Franz was rigorously taught at the select, demanding Old City Secondary School of Prague, where he excelled. He then studied law at German University in Prague, gained a Doctor of Law degree in 1906, and soon thereafter went to work for the Workers' Accident Insurance Company for the Kingdom of Bohemia in Prague, where he was promoted to vice secretary of the company in 1913, the year before he started writing The Trial. What does all this mean? It means that by 30, Franz Kafka seemed all ready to follow the script written for him by his upwardly striving parents, to take his place among the Gentile, German-speaking, thoroughly respectable bourgeoisie of Prague. But Kafka simply could not play this role. For one thing, he could never entirely forget his Jewishness. Even though his parents did their best to ensure his assimilation, they called his bar mitzvah a confirmation. Even though they did his best to ensure his assimilation, Kafka never became purely German. The German he wrote was tainted, or salted, if you will, not only by Czech idioms, but also by Yiddish, a language that he knew well enough to give a lecture on it in 1912. Secondly, even as he rose through the ranks of the Workers' Accident Insurance Company, Kafka was pursuing his ambition to write. At age 21, in a story called Description of a Struggle, he had already begun to forge a dreamlike language that could mediate between the conscious, objective mind and the subjective, unconscious, even as he struggled with the conflict between his urge to create and his compunction to succeed in conventional terms. In 1912, at the age of 29, he wrote two short stories, The Judgment and The Metamorphosis, and started a novel that was first called The Man Who Disappeared, and later America, spelled with a K, when it was published in 1927. These three works could be considered examples of fictive autobiography. They derive from novels such as Charles Dickens' Great Expectations and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, where the young protagonists rebel against one or more authority figures, but eventually grow up into marriage or a career, even if it takes a second generation to make the marriage contract stick, as in Wuthering Heights. In other words, the kind of fictive autobiography that Kafka inherits from the 19th century tells a story of rebellion and accommodation, disruption and restoration of the social order. But Kafka's first efforts at autobiography show how this traditional formula broke down in the face of modernism. Now, we've already seen that Conrad's Heart of Darkness adumbrates the advent of modernism. I now want to examine it more closely. First of all, modernism needs to be distinguished from modernity. Modernity is an historical condition largely defined and exemplified by advances in technology and fashion. The modern era, we could say, began with the invention of the automobile in the late 19th century, or the invention of the airplane at the beginning of the 20th. Modernity can also be seen in the plunging necklines that irritate the middle-aged Soames Forsyte in John Galsworthy's novel To Let, published in 1921, or in the spectacle of young women making themselves up in public, something that bothers the middle-aged Peter Walsh in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925. Chronologically, these markers of modernity coincide with the advent of modernism. But modernism is not an historical condition. It's rather a way of thinking and feeling collectively defined by leading writers, critics, and artists of the first part of the 20th century. Essentially, modernism spotlights the isolated self, the self cut off from all traditional, conventional sources of support, the self that never grows up into conformity and cooperation with the established social order. In thus spotlighting the isolated self, modernism recalls Romanticism, which reinvented autobiography in works such as Wordsworth's Prelude, and which celebrated the defiant individualism of figures like Byron's Childe Harold and Melville's Captain Ahab. But, an important but, the romantic individual is empowered by heroic self-confidence, or at least by the intensity of his vision. The modernist self feels drained of power. He feels helpless, vulnerable, and totally deracinated, stripped of all the ties that traditionally bind an identity together. He's pathetic and ridiculous, like the title figure of T.S. Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, who worries that people will notice his baldness and who won't even try to pose an overwhelming question at a tea party because he foresees that it will be simply dismissed. Since the modernist self is isolated in this way, the modernist novel highlights radical subjectivity by using techniques such as the interior monologue, and it challenges the conventional realism of time and space by making the present repeatedly give way to memories of the past, or, as with Kafka's Joseph K., to a wrenching sense of disorientation. With or without the predictable security of realistic time and space, the modernist hero is lonely. Leopold Bloom, the protagonist of James Joyce's Ulysses, has neither father nor son. His father committed suicide, his only son has died in infancy. And he feels so traumatized by that death that he has had no sexual intercourse with his wife for more than 10 years. Bloom himself is a resolute survivor, but the modernist self is often suicidal. In Mrs. Dalloway, Septimus Smith takes a fatal leap out of a window because he feels irredeemably guilty of the incapacity to feel anything for any other human being. He's been psychically shattered by the First World War, which literally destroyed many of the institutions that once gave individuals their place in society, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which started breaking up at the very time Kafka started writing The Trial. In the summer of 1914, when the war broke out, Kafka wanted to join the Austrian army. But with tubercular lungs and a practically skeletal 6-foot frame of just 115 pounds, he could scarcely qualify. Even if he had, he could scarcely have found his identity by fighting for Austria and Germany against Russia and the Serbs. Politically, Jewish Czechs had no place to go. On the one hand, even if they spoke German like Kafka, they were considered anti-German, modernist enemies of the German people and homeland. On the other hand, they got small comfort from the Czech nationalists who sought to break away from Austria and who identified with Russia. When the Czechs formed their first republic in 1918 with the help of the United States, they bound themselves to the Slovaks who were virulently anti-Semitic. So the war and its outcome simply accentuated Kafka's sense of isolation and alienation as a misfit in society, masquerading as a promising young professional man. Though he never went to war, Kafka resembles in some ways Septimus Smith, Like that 29-year-old war veteran who was highly regarded by the company that employed him, the 31-year-old Kafka was steadily climbing the ladder of corporate bureaucracy. But in 1912, the prospect of having to take charge of the family's asbestos factory led him to consider suicide. He felt equally incapable of taking the step that his parents urged upon him, getting married. Under pressure from them, and especially from his overbearing father, he got himself engaged to a young lady from Berlin named Felice Bauer in June of 1914. But the engagement soon fizzled. Just as Septimus Smith took no real solace from a marriage that he made by simple reflex from the war, Kafka could not bind himself to anyone and broke the engagement after just 1 month. Though he corresponded with Felice for 5 years, was briefly re-engaged to her in 1917 and considered her a great friend, he could not help seeing this practical, unimaginative woman as an enemy to his work. He married neither her nor another woman to whom he got engaged 2 years later. And though he lived with a young woman in Berlin for a few months during the last year of his life, he never married. To some extent, Joseph K. reflects and expresses Kafka's profoundly ambivalent response to Felice Bauer, as well as Kafka's general condition in 1914. As he started work on the trial in August of that year, he had just turned 31 and was vice secretary of an insurance company. His protagonist is the chief financial officer of a large bank and turns 30 on the day the novel begins. As for the women in his life, Joseph K. has both a mother and a girlfriend named Elsa, and at different times he sets out to visit them, not in the novel we have, but in fragments that may have found their way into the novel if Kafka had ever finished it to his satisfaction, which he did not. But even in these fragments, Joseph K. shows no real concern for either Elsa or his mother, or for any other woman that he meets. At most, he feels sexually aroused, especially since some of the women that he meets, such as Laney at the lawyer's apartment, are openly erotic and even promiscuous. The sexual passages in this novel underscore what might be called its Freudian theme, its exploration of the unconscious. In 1900, Sigmund Freud published his Interpretation of Dreams, which argued that dreams express desires and wishes that we typically repress in our conscious, well-behaved waking lives. Whether or not Kafka deliberately drew on Freud's theory of dreams, he could scarcely avoid its influence, and the strange life of Joseph K. sometimes seems to exemplify it. Ostensibly, Joseph is a very proper as well as professionally diligent young man. He normally works at his office till 9 at night, takes a walk, then sits at a tavern with a group of mostly older men until 11 p.m. Hardly a playboy. But in the second chapter, he waits up till nearly midnight for Fräulein Bürstner, the young typist who occupies a room next to his own in the boarding house where he lives. Waiting until she comes back from a night at the theater, he wants to apologize for the disturbance made in her room by the men who used it to interrogate him in the morning and who mixed up her collection of photographs. But instead of just quickly apologizing for the disturbance or leaving her a note, Joseph gets himself invited into the young lady's room. When he tells her that he's being interrogated by a commission of inquiry, she laughs at the idea that this highly proper young man could be guilty of anything. But she stops short of admitting that he's totally guiltless and decides only, "You can't have committed any serious crime." She does well to hedge her bet, for Joseph proves himself something of a pest. Late as it is, he keeps her up while he reenacts the inquiry, showing how the inspector moved her nightstand away from her bed so as to use it as a desk, and then shouted his name, "Joseph K." Fräulein Bürstner laughs at this theatrical performance, but when it provokes a loud set of knocks at the door of the next room, where the landlady's nephew is staying, she's so alarmed that she wants Joseph to leave at once. "Go, go," she says, "you're tormenting me." But Joseph stays. Seeing that she's alarmed by what the man next door can hear, Joseph says she can tell everyone that he himself assaulted her, because he feels quite sure that nothing he does will shake the landlady's devotion to him. Then, when she calmly rejects the idea of spreading this insulting story around and tells him again to leave, he finally does so, but only after assaulting her. Rushing out, we read, he seized her, kissed her on the mouth, then all over the face like a thirsty animal lapping greedily at a spring it has found at last. Then he kissed her on the neck, right at her throat, and left his lips there for a long time. Like Dr. Jekyll turning into Mr. Hyde, the proper young financial officer becomes a monster of sexual voracity, a vampire. Scenes like this one cannot be explained by the logic of daytime. Like the whole experience of being arrested and put on trial for a crime that is never specified, they make sense only if we envision Joseph as caught up in a dream of his own making, a dream that liberates his deepest longings, anxieties, and fears. Kafka wrote to liberate his own psyche. On August 6, 1914, as he started work on the trial, he wrote in his diary, "My talent for portraying my dreamlike inner life has thrust all other matters into the background. My life has dwindled dreadfully, nor will it cease to dwindle. Nothing else will satisfy me." Kafka's story of Joseph K., the story of a man caught in a network of laws that he will never understand and from which he will never escape. Kafka's story resembles nothing so much as a nightmare from which it is impossible to awake. In Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which first appeared in 1899, Marlowe says what Kafka might have said about his own story. "It seems to me I am trying to tell you a dream, making vain attempt, because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation, that commingling of absurdity, surprise, and bewilderment in a tremor of struggling revolt, that notion of being captured by the incredible, which is the very essence of dreams." Bound up with that essence is the sense of radical displacement. As I have said already, the modernist self, exemplified by Joseph K., is a man radically deracinated, cut off from the reference points that traditionally define us. In some ways, the story of Joseph K. is the literary counterpart of abstract art, which blanks out all the realistic shapes that bind traditional art to the world we know, which plunge us into a world of color and form cut loose from the ground we tread on and from any object we might recognize. Kafka wipes out most of Joseph K.'s family name. We get just the first letter. Furthermore, unlike Joyce's Ulysses and Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, both of which appeared about the same time as the trial, and both of which are set in capital cities, Kafka's novel names only its characters. It never names the city where Joseph lives and works. It never names anything in that city, not a building, not a monument, not a single street. The absence of any such localizing information reinforces the sense of displacement and disorientation that we persistently get from this novel, where courts of inquiry and legal consultations are held in places totally unsuitable for them, like cramped bedrooms and stuffy attics. The sense of dislocation begins with the very first sentence of the book. Someone must have slandered Joseph K. For one morning, without having done anything truly wrong, he was arrested. Like so much else in this novel, Joseph K.'s crime, or would-be crime, is never specified, never named. Since there is no moral place for Joseph's guilt, we are left to speculate about it. Is it some trace of the original sin that we all inherit from Adam, as the Bible teaches us? Is it something like what we get from Wordsworth in The Prelude and Pip in Great Expectations, both of whom vividly recall feelings of guilt from their childhoods? To both of these questions, I would answer no. Joseph K. shows no consciousness of original sin, and unlike Wordsworth and Pip, he remembers absolutely nothing that he has ever done wrong. To the very first inspector who comes to interrogate him, he says, "I can't think of the slightest offense of which I might be accused." Joseph has a habit of sounding self-righteous, which is in fact just one of his faults. The very first sentence of the book portrays him as a victim of slander, but he himself comes near to slandering Fraulein Bürstner when he complains to the landlady about the late hours she keeps, thus prompting the landlady to decry her misconduct. And even though Joseph angrily defends her against the landlady's suspicions, he himself assaults her, as we have already seen, and then walks off pleased with his conduct. So in part, the novel shows us that Joseph is not nearly as innocent as he claims to be, especially when he flings accusations at others. Speaking to the examining magistrate of the Attic court, he complains that he was, quote, assaulted in the morning in bed by two guards who proved to be corrupt ruffians. They wanted bribes. They wanted money, supposedly to bring me breakfast, after they'd shamelessly eaten my own breakfast before my very own eyes. Joseph overstates the facts. One of the guards entered his bedroom after knocking, but no one assaulted him there or anywhere else. The guards did eat his breakfast, but their demand for bribes amounted simply to offering to buy him a breakfast from a coffee house if he would put up the money. One evening later on, when Joseph looks into a junk room at the bank where he works, he finds the two guards, Franz and Willem, with a flogger. Because of Joseph's complaints against these two guards, they will not only be flogged, but will lose all prospects for advancement. Distressed by this news, convinced that only the high officials of the court are truly guilty, Joseph offers to bribe the flogger. "I'll reward you well if you'll let them go," he says, even though he has already told the examining magistrate that he would never bribe anyone. But the flogger is a man of principle. "I can't be bribed," he says. "I've been hired to flog, and flog I will." The whole scene bristles with irony. Though Joseph K. believes that he has already begun to fight corruption in the judicial system, he himself tries to corrupt the flogger so as to thwart the consequences of his own complaints against the system. But before he can raise his offer, the flogger takes the rod to Franz, and Franz's inhuman scream makes Joseph fear that other people in the building will come and find him dealing with this scummy trio in the mudroom. So when Franz screams, Joseph tells him not to, pushes him to the floor, steps out of the flogging room, and slams the door. Joseph is obviously flawed. No matter how self-righteously he tries to proclaim his innocence and fight the corruption of the legal system, he cannot avoid the taint of corruption himself. In Kafka's vision of the world, guilt is inescapably part of the human condition, and certainly of his own life. Several months after starting work on the trial, Kafka told his diary that he wrote, quote, "in the consciousness that my guilt is beyond question," unquote. Does he feel guilty for failing to fight with the Austrian army, for breaking his engagement with Felice Bauer, for disappointing his father's expectations, or for failing to write at more than what he calls a miserable crawl? Kafka doesn't answer this question, any more than he tells us specifically just what crime Joseph K. has committed, or whether he is guilty of anything at all. But whatever he is, Joseph is something more than a spotless victim. He thrashes about in response to his plight, and in the process, he hurts other people. Yet if Joseph hurts others, he himself is hurt most of all, relentlessly victimized by a legal system that makes him a defendant, but indefinitely defers any chance of acquittal, or even of a fair trial based on specific charges. As Joseph is told by a painter named Tintorelli, who has learned about the law from the judges that he paints, there are just three possible ways of settling the case against a defendant: actual acquittal, apparent acquittal, and protraction. After admitting that he has never seen a single case of actual acquittal, the painter defines apparent acquittal as a merely temporary finding of innocence, yielding a freedom that may end at any time. Such an acquittal may be followed by an immediate arrest, and even if the defendant gains a second acquittal, that too may be followed by an arrest, and so on endlessly. The only alternative is protraction, whereby the defendant keeps his case at the lowest stage by regularly visiting the judge and responding to interrogations. But whether the defendant gets apparent acquittal or protraction, he is sentenced to a life of paralyzing suspense. This is one reason why Joseph K. decides to dismiss his lawyer and accept his execution. Legal delays, of course, furnished matter for fiction well before Kafka wrote The Trial. In Charles Dickens' Bleak House, published in 1851 and 2, the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce takes so many years to resolve it that it consumes all the money in dispute. 40 years after Dickens' novel appeared, the real world furnished a celebrated instance of justice delayed in a criminal case. In 1894, A French army captain named Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of espionage in a secret military court-martial that ignored his protestations of innocence and gave him no access to the evidence against him. Stripped of his rank and sentenced to life imprisonment, he was vilified by anti-Semitic voices that all too readily identified his Jewishness with treachery, and he had to wait 12 years for exoneration. Joseph K. is nowhere called Jewish, but he was conceived by a Jewish writer, and the burden of unspecified guilt that he is made to bear might be construed as signifying all the guilt that has been placed for centuries on the backs of the Jewish people. In any case, Joseph K. is punished far beyond what he deserves, and in the dreamlike world of Kafka's novel, his fate reveals how inscrutable, how irrational, and how implacable the law may be.